It was late October 1944. American troops were pouring ashore at Leyte, and the ships of Task Unit 77.4.3, known as Taffy 3, took their station east of Samar on the chart in Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's map room aboard the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay. The thin line of 6 jeep carriers and 7 screening destroyers and destroyer escorts was the only barrier between the invasion beaches and the open Pacific. The Japanese High Command had a plan. Codenamed Show 1, it called for a massive counterattack to crush the American landing force. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the mighty Third Fleet, was chasing a decoy. A Japanese carrier force under Admiral Ozawa was steaming north, and Halsey took the bait. Convinced the main Japanese battle fleet was crippled, he pulled his big carriers and fast battleships away from San Bernardino Strait, leaving it wide open. That night, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita led the Japanese center force through the unguarded passage. 4 battleships, including the gigantic Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, and a swarm of destroyers, steamed south toward Leyte Gulf. The men of Taffy 3, asleep in their bunks or standing the midnight watch, had no idea the enemy was already inside the net. October the 25th began as a routine morning for the men of Taffy 3. The escort carriers had launched their dawn combat air patrols, and the screening destroyers were at condition 2, half the crew at their stations. Then, at 6:45, an Avenger pilot broke radio silence with a report that stunned the fleet. Ensign Bill Brooks, flying from the St. Lo, had spotted the impossible. The Japanese center force, battleships and cruisers stretching across the eastern horizon, was bearing down on them from the northwest. The surprise was total. Aboard the Fanshawe Bay, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague received the news and acted instantly. He knew there was no help coming. Halsey was chasing a decoy far to the north, and the fast battleships of Task Force 34 were not coming back in time. Sprague gave the order every captain in the task unit dreaded: launch every aircraft, make smoke, and head east into a rain squall at flank speed. The jeep carriers were fleeing for their lives, and only the thin destroyer screen stood between them and destruction. On the bridge of the destroyer Johnston, Commander Ernest Evans did not wait for orders. He had seen the same towering pagoda masts, the same broad line of enemy hulls, and he knew what he had to do. Evans keyed the ship's intercom and announced his intention to attack, then ordered general quarters. The alarm clanged through every compartment, a harsh metallic summons that sent men scrambling to their battle stations. Evans turned the Johnston directly toward the Japanese van and ordered flank speed. Within minutes, the destroyer was racing through a storm of colored shell splashes as Japanese battleships found her range. Evans did not flinch. He held his course until his torpedo officer reported a firing solution, then gave the order. The Johnston launched its full spread of torpedoes. Seconds stretched into minutes, and then a massive eruption lifted the Japanese cruiser Kumano, her bow blown away in a geyser of flame and steel. With the Johnston's attack having drawn blood, the other American destroyers joined the charge. Commander Amos Hathaway on the Heermann and Commander Leon Kintberger on the Hull swung their ships into the same deadly path, racing through curtains of shellfire toward the enemy battle line. The Japanese shifted fire, the sea erupting around the little ships in towers of colored water as they pressed forward. The Hull took the heaviest punishment. Heavy caliber shells struck her superstructure, knocking out her main battery and sweeping the bridge with fragments. Kintberger, wounded and bleeding, struggled to keep his ship in the fight as the Hull lost power and began to list. Still, her torpedo crews managed to fire their weapons at the approaching battleships before the damage overwhelmed her. To the south, the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts under Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland entered the engagement. Copeland steered his tiny ship within point-blank range of the Japanese cruiser Chikuma and opened fire with his 5-inch guns. The Roberts landed hit after hit, setting the Chikuma's superstructure ablaze and forcing the cruiser to maneuver wildly. The Johnston, though battered and burning from repeated hits, refused to quit. Evans continued to press the attack, firing at every Japanese target within reach, even as his ship groaned under relentless punishment. Japanese land-based aircraft from the Philippines now added their bombs and strafing runs to the onslaught, forcing Vice Admiral Kurita's battle line to twist and turn. Under this combined pressure, and uncertain of the American strength before him, Kurita ordered his fleet to turn north to regroup. The whole was dying. Commander Kintberger, wounded but still on his feet, tried to steer his shattered ship toward one more target. The Japanese battleships had found the range, and their heavy shells slammed into the destroyer's thin hull again and again. Kintberger knew the whole could not survive another hit. He ordered his crew to fire their remaining torpedoes, hoping to buy the carriers one more minute of safety. Then a salvo of 14-inch shells struck the bridge directly, severely wounding Kintberger and killing most of his command staff in an instant. The whole, her back broken and her decks awash, began to settle by the stern. Men poured over the side into the oil-slicked water as the ship rolled heavily to port. By 8:55 that morning, the destroyer was gone, taking 267 of her 325 crew with her. Gun 52, under the command of Gunner's Mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr, had fired over 300 shells in the past hour. Carr, a stocky Texan with a calm voice, worked his crew relentlessly, loading and firing as fast as the breach would close. They had set the Chikuma's superstructure ablaze and were still pouring fire into her when a Japanese 6-inch shell found its mark. Aboard the Roberts, Gun 52 had been firing without pause all morning. The round struck the gun mount directly, tearing the enclosure open like a tin can. The explosion killed Gunner's Mate Paul Henry Carr and most of his crew instantly. Only the gun's pointer, a young sailor named Bill Stovall, survived the blast, mortally wounded. Stovall, his lungs scorched, continued to track the enemy and fire until his strength gave out. Then the gun fell silent and the Roberts, mortally wounded herself, began to list. To the north, the Johnston was in her final agony. Commander Evans, his ship's power and steering gone, had been directing the fight from the stern, shouting orders to the surviving crew. A Japanese shell had taken off part of his hand, but he refused to leave his post. The Johnston, battered and burning, was down by the bow and settling fast. Evans gave the order to abandon ship. Men leaped into the water as the destroyer rolled onto her side, her propellers still turning. Evans was seen in the water alive, but he did not survive the morning. He was last seen waving his good hand at his crew, urging them to swim clear of the sinking ship. The Johnston slipped beneath the waves at approximately 10:10, taking 184 of her crew with her. The Japanese ship steamed past her wreck without pausing, but the destroyer's desperate charge had bought the escort carriers precious time. Aboard the Fanshawe Bay, Admiral Sprague had been watching the slaughter of his screen with a heavy heart. The whole, the Johnston, and the Samuel B. Roberts were gone, and the Gambier Bay had been sunk by gunfire. But the air attacks from Taffy 2 and Taffy 3 were pounding the Japanese fleet mercilessly. On the bridge of the Yamato, Vice Admiral Kurita faced a difficult decision. His cruisers were damaged, his formation was broken, and American planes were swarming from every direction. He had lost the element of surprise and was taking losses he could not replace. The escort carrier Gambier Bay had already been torn apart by Japanese gunfire, listing heavily as flames consumed her hangar deck. She slipped beneath the waves, the only American carrier sunk by surface action in the war. Aboard the Fanshawe Bay, Admiral Sprague watched his screen disintegrate, but the air attacks from Taffy 2 and Taffy 3 were now hammering the Japanese fleet without mercy. Kurita had lost the element of surprise and was taking losses he could not replace. At 9:25 that morning, he gave the order to withdraw. The Japanese center force turned north and steamed back toward San Bernardino Strait, leaving the battered remnants of Taffy 3 to drift in the water. The surface battle was over. The ordeal of the survivors had just begun. Nearly 1,000 men from the sunken ships were now in the water, covered in thick fuel oil that stung their eyes and clung to their skin. The oil was a curse, but it also had a strange benefit. For now, it seemed to keep the sharks at a distance. The men clung to rafts and pieces of wreckage, watching the fins cut the surface just beyond the slick. Just before 11 o'clock, a new horror struck the formation. A Japanese suicide plane, a Zero, dove out of the clouds toward the escort carrier, St. Lo. There was no time to react. The plane crashed through the flight deck and exploded deep inside the hangar bay, igniting a chain of fuel and ammunition detonations. It was the first deliberate kamikaze attack of the battle. The St. Lo was blown apart from within. Flames and smoke rose hundreds of feet into the air, and within 30 minutes the carrier had sunk. Her crew went into the water alongside the men from the Johnston, the Gambier Bay, and other lost ships. The sea around Samar was now a crowded graveyard of survivors, clinging to life in a widening patch of oil and debris. The enemy ships were gone, but the fight was far from over. When a ship sinks, the battlefield vanishes. Currents shift, thermal layers mix, and the water that witnessed the slaughter is nowhere to be found. For the survivors of the whole, the Gambier Bay, the Samuel B. Roberts, and the Johnston, the sudden silence after their ships were swallowed was the first thing many noticed. To them, the quiet was unwelcome. The roar of battle had anesthetized fear. Now that noise lifted like a curtain, unveiling the hidden depths of their grief and shock. Nearly 1,000 men dotted the ocean swells east of Samar, cast about by currents and wind. The lazy waves raised and lowered them at regular intervals. From the top of a swell, a man could scan for other survivors. In the troughs, surrounded by gentle slopes of seawater, he was left to contemplate his private misery. The peaks of Samar were visible where the clouds permitted, but the beaches lay some 30 miles away. For a wounded, exhausted swimmer, it might as well have been a whole ocean. One of the survivors, Robert's crewman George Bray, scooped up a handful of black foam and smeared it over his shoeless left foot. The last thing a man needed was a shark mistaking a white sock for an appetizer. The oil that fouled their hair and faces was a curse, stinging their eyes and clinging to their skin, but it also proved to be an unexpected blessing. It coated them completely, masking their identities from one another, and acted as an effective shark repellent. The high-grade American fuel also worked as a sunscreen, protecting their skin from the blazing South Pacific sun. Throughout the second day, the struggle to stay alive consumed every ounce of strength. Tom Stevenson, the first lieutenant of the Samuel B. Roberts, floated with the men around Copeland's raft, praying silently. If God got him out of this, he vowed, he would become the best husband and raise a great family. That was all he would ask. Around them, men paired off, taking turns holding each other's faces out of the water so one could sleep. The warmth of the tropical sea masked its life-threatening nature, slowly sapping their body heat. Charles Natter, a signalman third class, spent hours trying to unite stragglers with the main group. He swam to men clinging to a pair of wooden planks, struggling to propel the sagging mast through the water. But the sharks ended the tease and acted on their nature. One of them came up and pulled a friend from the plank. Natter had little time to mourn. Another big fin glided toward him, and he was hauled under too. He was one of several men taken that afternoon. As night deepened, delirium set in. The product of fatigue and ingested salt water, it had a phantasmagoric effect on the brain. Tom Stevenson became convinced that the ship was right below him, that a scuttlebutt full of cool fresh water was waiting for him on the first deck. Fortunately, he spoke his plan aloud. Other men grabbed hold of him and tied him fast to the floater net. Through the night, most of the men had dalliances with madness, wandering off in search of lemonade, coffee, or warm home cooking. The rescue that came was agonizingly late. Initial coordinates given to the 7th Fleet were off by a wide margin, and it was not until the afternoon of October 25th that a serious search began. For nearly 2 days, the men drifted while rescue ships steamed to the wrong position. The delay was fatal for many. An estimated 116 men died at sea before help arrived. The mistakes of high command had influenced how the ordeal would end. On the morning of October 27th, the patrol craft PC-623, under Lieutenant Commander James Baxter, spotted red, white, and green very flares on the horizon, defying orders to maintain formation. The officer of the deck turned toward the contact. When the ship reached the survivors, a crewman shouted down the challenge, "Who won the World Series?" The correct reply came back. "St. Louis, goddammit!" A Jacob's ladder was tossed over the side and the rescue began. Baxter's task group of 7 ships pulled over 1,150 survivors from the sea. The decks of the PC-623 grew so crowded that 5,000 gallons of fuel had to be pumped overboard to keep the vessel from foundering. Men from the Samuel B. Roberts, the Johnston, the Hull, and the Gambier Bay were brought aboard together. Some, like water tender Jerry Osborne, died on the deck just minutes after being hauled from the water. The rescue was quick, concentrated work, but for many it had come too late. Not all survivors were picked up by ships. Quartermaster Neil Deathlefs of the Johnston found himself adrift with another sailor after his ship went down. Stung by jellyfish and fading in and out of consciousness, he eventually washed up on a coral reef. A crowd of Filipinos on the beach began yelling at him. One of them ran across the coral, picked him up, and carried him to shore. Deathlefs could not walk. His legs were torn from the sharp reef, and his groin was covered in saltwater sores. He was taken to a cabin in the jungle, where hands rubbed cocoa butter on his wounds. He awoke once to drops of water falling on his face. Looking up, he saw the wide brown face of a Filipino woman crying, "Hello, Mama," he said to her. She had once been married to an American military man and adopted him on the spot. They told him he was on the island of Ande, about 3 miles off Samar. Deathlefs was eventually taken to a guerrilla headquarters run by Juan Bocar, a Manila attorney and former national representative. There he met other Americans separated from their units, including a Navy dive bomber gunner. With the help of Filipino guides and an American colonel, Deathlefs made his way by boat south to Leyte Gulf. An American landing craft flagged them down, and within days Deathlefs was aboard a troop ship in the harbor of Leyte. He had survived the ordeal at sea thanks to the courage of strangers in a foreign land. In the days following the rescue, the survivors of Taffy 3 were carried into Leyte Gulf aboard the crowded patrol craft and landing ships. The wounded were transferred to hospital ships like the Comfort, while the able-bodied rested on transport decks, their bodies still glazed with dried fuel oil and salt. Some did not survive the journey. Aboard one of the rescue vessels, Chief Radioman Tullio Serafini of the Samuel B. Roberts lay on a cot near the fantail, his legs and shoulder torn open by shrapnel. As his shipmates gathered around him crying, the old chief passed away. He was the kind of man, his captain later said, that any sailor would be proud to call his father. As the fleet sorted out the dead from the living, the Navy began to hand out its honors. Commander Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his leadership aboard the Johnston, the only Taffy 3 sailor to receive the nation's highest award. Admiral Clifton Sprague received the Navy Cross, as did Captain Robert Copeland, Commander Amos Hathaway, and several of the pilots who had thrown their planes at the Japanese fleet. But behind the citations, a bitter silence settled over the high command. Fleet Admiral William Halsey, who had left San Bernardino Strait unguarded while chasing a decoy, faced quiet criticism from his peers. Admiral Chester Nimitz himself believed Halsey had blundered, but he suppressed open condemnation, fearing the damage it would do to the Navy's public reputation. For decades after the war, the men of Taffy 3 carried their memories in private. They corresponded with shipmates, attended small reunions, and tried to bury the pain of what they had seen. But on October the 24th, 1977, a group of veterans from the escort carrier Gambier Bay returned to the waters off Samar. Led by their former executive officer and their chaplain, they boarded a Philippine Navy ship and steamed into the swells where their ship had gone down. A typhoon loomed somewhere over the horizon, raising whitecaps and long, rolling waves. One of the men said, "They're telling us they know we're here. They're kicking up the sea from below." Chaplain Werner Carlson began reading the eulogy as the ship's historian stepped forward with a cylindrical capsule. The container was stenciled with the name of the Gambier Bay and packed with the personal effects of the dead, along with American and Philippine flags. One by one, as the names of the lost were called aloud, wives of the survivors stepped to the rail and dropped red carnations into the sea. A Filipino honor guard fired a single rifle shot. The historian said, "We now commit this capsule to the deep, in loving memory of you, our killed in action and deceased shipmates." The capsule splashed into the water and sank into the darkness below, carrying with it the weight of 33 years of silence. Quartermaster Neil Deathlefs, who washed ashore on Samar and was sheltered by Filipino guerrillas, survived the war and returned to civilian life. Commander Leon Kintberger, severely wounded but alive, survived the ordeal and later received the Navy Cross for his valor. Lieutenant Tom Stevenson, who had prayed for a chance to raise a family while adrift, survived and fulfilled that vow in his civilian life. Ensign Bill Brooks, who first spotted the Japanese fleet that morning, survived the war and returned to civilian life, a quiet hero who rarely spoke of that day. Signalman Charles Natter, who gave his life trying to save his shipmates from sharks, is remembered for his selfless courage. Admiral Kurita lived out his remaining years in Japan, a figure of controversy, forever haunted by his decision to withdraw on the brink of victory. The records are not silent on these men, and their names live on in the ships that followed. A guided missile frigate named Copeland, another named Carr, and a third named for Clifton Sprague himself. The historian Samuel Eliot Morison wrote that no engagement in the Navy's entire history matched the 2 hours of resolution and sacrifice off Samar. But the men who were there measured success in simpler terms. They saw themselves not as legends, but as kids who had done what needed to be done. As one of them put it, "I'm still trying to tell my father that I've been a good son, that I've honored him, and that I hope he's pleased with the way I've conducted myself." That is the true legacy of the tin can sailors, not medals or monuments, but the quiet knowledge that when the moment came, they did not look away. If you have family stories from this era, letters, photographs, or memories passed down, share them in the comments below. We read every one. Subscribe to the channel and give this video a like to support more documentaries like this. Thank you for listening.